Today I'll be exploring educational opportunities for children of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander background. Our focus is on how education policy shapes and sometimes restricts Indigenous children's opportunities and how a more democratic and ethical approach could lead to a fairer educational opportunities and outcomes. Looking at the current policy landscape, Australia's foundational policy is the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education Policy of 1989, most recently modified on the 27th of September 2022 by the Australian Government Department of Education. It's a foundational document designed to achieve equity of access, participation and outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In New South Wales, the Aboriginal Education Policy, revised in 2020, works in partnership with the New South Wales Aboriginal Education Consultative Group. It focuses on community partnerships, culture and identity. At a national level, the Closing the Gap Agreement 2020 sets educational targets such as Year 12 attainment and school readiness. Additionally, the ATSI Education Strategy 2021 to 2025 emphasises embedding Indigenous knowledges and culturally responsive teaching. While these policies signal strong intent, the outcomes remain inconsistent with the desired result across Australia. However, several issues arise with these policies. An article by UTS 2025 questioning why do so many Indigenous programs and policies fail describes how many are still implemented from a top-down perspective, policies done to Indigenous communities rather than done with them as co-designed with communities, reducing agency and participation. This undermines autonomy and self-determination. The persistent deficit framing of Indigenous learners also reinforces stereotypes and limits agency, where an article by the Mangrove Team 2025 suggesting reframing to asset framing would be beneficial to avoid these negative outcomes. Curriculum inclusion of Indigenous content is often tokenistic, failing to authentically represent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges. An article by Riley T 2024 and other authors' findings emphasise the importance of listening to Indigenous voices to ensure schools promote intercultural understanding and adequately serve all learners' needs. Lack of sustained systematic change. Despite decades of policy interventions, many improvements have been slow, uneven, or stagnating. Systematic problems such as teacher turnover in remote communities, under-resourcing, and structural inequities persist. Ethically, this connects to the principles of justice, autonomy, and fidelity, as their importance is highlighted in the article Principles of Clinical Ethics and Their Application to Practice by Varkey B in 2021. Despite decades of reform, systematic inequities and under-resourcings continue to create barriers to success. The system's promises often fail and don't align with the lived experience of individuals and communities. The research, insights and literature I found strongly supports these concerns. The article Indigenous Education Policy, Practice and Research, Unravelling the Tangled Web 2022 by Shay M and colleagues describes how policy, research and practice often work in isolation, producing inconsistent and ineffective outcomes. The article Indigenous Education and Literacy Policy in Australia by Fagati and colleagues critique how literacy policies often flatten cultural specificity and tighten control, limiting pedagogical freedom. A systematic review on co-design in Indigenous education policy and practice finds that when Indigenous communities lead in design, outcomes improve, but warns that co-design is often watered down and deeper power issues remain. Envisioning Education Sovereignty Through Story by the Australian Journal of Indigenous Education states some Indigenous scholars argue for more radical re-imaging of schooling beyond reform and towards Indigenous controlled systems. Curriculum as Policy Deception, a critical analysis of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge inclusion in the Australian curriculum, a recent paper by Kevin Lowe and colleagues, argues that many inclusions are superficial, reinforcing epistemic hierarchies. Collectively, this research warns that superficial curriculum inclusion can reinforce these hierarchies, privileging Western knowledge and marginalising Indigenous epistemologies. Overall, Indigenous-led and co-designed approaches consistently produce stronger engagements and outcomes. Proposal is the development of community-governed microschool networks. Locally governed microschools are small local schooling units, for example, small remote or regional communities, managed by Indigenous community governance boards in partnership with qualified educators. The curriculum, pedagogy and schedule are co-determined by local Indigenous knowledge holders and elders. Flexible hybrid programming combine in-person teaching with digital and remote support, use blended learning so that small communities are not deprived of subject specialties like advanced science by connecting via high-quality remote teachers, but under the oversight of local cultural governance. Language and culture as foundational, not additive. The micro schools treat Indigenous languages, stories, cosmologies, and local environmental knowledges as the core foundational and curriculum. Standard Western disciplines like math, science, and English are embedded in culturally meaningful contexts. Reciprocal teachers residency programs, educators, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, engage in a multi-year residencies, learning local languages, protocols, and cultural framing prior to taking roles. This builds relational trust and reduces overall turnover. Regional hub support networks, staffed by specialties, pedagogical coaches, digital infrastructure, and tracer evaluation teams, support several micro schools. The hub ensures quality and helps share the best practices and facilitates resource sharing. Accountability to community and citizens, rather than only reporting to government metrics, these micro schools publish community defined success indicators, and not just test scores but metrics of cultural well-being, community retention, language revitalization to local stakeholders and broader public. The proposal addresses ethical, democratic and citizenship concerns through justice and autonomy by locating decision-making in community and model respects autonomy, and helps dismantle top-down deficit policies. Fidelity and trust, because communities co-own the schools, trust is built. The state is not simply imposing but enabling. Benefits, the model aims to do good, culturally safe schooling, and avoid harm like cultural destruction and alienation. Democratic citizenship, this proposal fosters active civic participation. Students become citizens of two worlds, their Indigenous lineage and the broader polity, taught to contribute across knowledge systems. It also models democratic governance at a local level. Sustainability and self-determination. Over time, micro schools could form a federated Indigenous schooling network, shifting from being inside the state to a more self-determined space, enhancing sovereignty. By reconciling Western and Indigenous knowledge systems under local governance, and by making schooling relevant, respectful and accountable, children may become empowered citizens rather than passive recipients. Of course, such a proposal has high risks and barriers. Funding and scalability. Governments may resist ceding control or funding alternative governance forms. Teaching capacity. Recruiting teachers willing to commit to long-term residencies, engage with Indigenous learning frames. Quality assurance. Ensuring academic rigor, meeting external standards while preserving cultural autonomy could conflict. Resistance and inertia. Bureaucracies may resist disruption. Implementation pathway. Pilot in willing communities, especially in communities currently underserved by mainstream schooling. Seed funding and phase transition. Governments provide transitional grants, community matches with philanthropic or local investment. Rigorous evaluation or iterative co-design. Used matching qualitative and quantitative metrics with evaluation led by Indigenous researchers. Policy recognition. Advocate for enabling legislative framework that allows alternative governance of these micro schools. Network scaling. If pilots show promise. Expands network hubs across regions, maintaining local governance but shared infrastructure. In closing, I believe that persistent gaps in educational outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are not simply technical problems, but deeply political, ethical, and epistemic challenges. The traditional policy of closing the gap is too often fall short in patterns of deficit control and superficial inclusion. A shift to community-governed micro schools networks offers a pathway towards educational sovereignty, more ethical alignment, and a future in which Indigenous children learn in ways that honour their languages, cultures, and identities, while also being fully equipped to participate as citizens in plural Australia. Thanks for listening.